Today, we are talking about one of my favorite things on earth to eat, and that is rich, smoky, fatty, flavorful ribs. And what better way to make ribs than to sous vide them? Sure, you can throw them on the smoker, you can watch them all day, you can make some great ribs when you smoke them. A lot of people know how to do that. But sous vide ribs are my favorite type of ribs, and I'm going to show you everything that I know about making them so you can make some amazing ones at home. Coming up next on Amazing Food Made Easy. Hey there, I'm Jason Loxton from Amazing Food Made Easy and president of the International Sous Vide Association, and today we are diving into sous vide ribs. I love ribs. I think they're amazingly tender and flavorful, and when they're done right, they have this little bit of bite to them, but still fall off the bone. They're so amazing. One of my favorite things on earth to eat. I want to dive into how you can use sous vide to simplify the process. Now, I am not a person that says you have to sous vide everything. I think sous vide is just one more tool in your kitchen toolkit. So if you love smoking ribs, if you love being out there at your smoker all day, if you have your process down, enjoy it. I'm not telling you what you're doing is wrong in any way whatsoever. I'm just providing another way to try cooking them, because a lot of people struggle to make perfectly cooked ribs. And with sous vide, you can make them perfect every single time. So I'm going to show you how to do that. First thing to remember is there's several types of ribs. We're going to focus exclusively on pork ribs today. The beef ribs are their own kind of beast. But even with pork ribs, there's a lot of different kinds, and people don't always know the difference because they look very similar. Most of them are actually just trimmed differently. They're the same main cut of meat. So first ribs we're going to talk about are baby back or back ribs. These come from the upper ribs or the upper back. They're high on the back of the pig. These are actually the same ribs that if you get a pork chop that has a bone on it, that is the same thing as a baby back or back rib. They are made up of the loin meat, which is less fatty, smaller, is a little more tender, and they're the best if you want a more kind of chop-like consistency, which you can do with sous vide, cooking them at like 140. They can turn out almost like a pork chop, but on a rack of ribs. It's a really cool, unique presentation. The next type is the spare ribs or the side ribs. These are the lower ribs from the underbelly and behind the shoulder. They generally have less meat, but they're tastier, they're flatter, they can be a bit tougher, which sous vide can get rid of. In a lot of people's opinion, they are the tastiest ribs. They're a little bit fatter, they are tougher, which you can break down using the sous vide process. They're a little bit thicker, and you have a lot of kind of meat and heft on these types of ribs, especially when you use sous vide to cook them for a longer amount of time to tenderize them and break down some of that connective tissue. You also have St. Louis ribs, which are basically fancy spare ribs. And while spare ribs are a thicker, meatier variation, St. Louis style ribs are trimmed down with the brisket bone removed, so they're a little bit easier to handle, a little bit easier to cook and break down. They're more trimmed and square, so you can put them in a sous vide bag a little bit easier. And St. Louis ribs are some of the ones that I turn to most of the time. Those and spare ribs are my two go-tos, and I almost never cook baby back ribs anymore unless I'm going for that lower temperature, more unique presentation. Finally, there's country style ribs, and these aren't really a specific cut. It's kind of like a London broil, that it's more of a preparation method and can mean different things. It's often the blade end of the loin, the top of the pork shoulder, it can be rib chops. There's boneless, there's bone-in. They're usually fatty and marbled like a pork chop, but they are from different places. They're kind of handled differently than other ribs. So in this video, I'm going to really focus on baby back ribs, spare ribs, and St. Louis style ribs, because those all come from the same kind of section and they can be handled and sous vide very, very similarly. So what is the perfect time and temperature to make sous vide ribs at? Well, what are you trying to accomplish? With sous vide, you have exact control over the final doneness and the final texture. So your ribs can range from almost pork chop light, staying on the bone with a lot of bite to them, all the way up through, it's so tender falling off the bone that you're probably not going to be able to take them out of the bag with them staying on the ribs. So it really depends, what do you want to accomplish? My favorite combination is probably 152 degrees for 18 to 24 hours. It's really tender, but it's still moist, it's still juicy. It's not really fall apart, but it definitely just comes off the bone when you bite it very, very easily. I think that 150 to 152 range is like the perfect barbecue, the perfect pot roast, the perfect braised-like texture for a lot of things that I'm trying to do. And for ribs, it is a crowd favorite. People love ribs cooked like that. Some other really popular combinations are 165 for 18 to 24 hours again. These are going to be more tender, more falling off the bone, but they're still going to have a little bit of bite. They're not as juicy as the ones at 150, but they are more tender if that's the direction you're trying to go. Another popular one is 176 for about 12 hours. You've reduced the cooking time a lot, but these ribs are going to be falling apart. If you like ribs that don't stick to the bone, that are almost shreddable texture, this is the temperature and time that you're going to be wanting to go for. And as I said, with sous vide, you can make pork chop like ribs. These are going to have a lot of bite. They're going to have a lot of juice. They're going to be really flavorful, tender, but not fall apart tender. For that, I usually like about 140 for 1 to 2 days. The taste and texture is more like a pork chop than a traditional rib, but it is on the rack, so you have that presentation. You have a unique experience for a lot of people that be trying that. But for those of you saying, but I love the smoke flavor, how do you get smoke into sous vide ribs? There's 2 ways to do it, and we'll dive into this a little bit more when we talk about the actual process, but you can smoke beforehand or you can smoke after. If you ask 100 people whether they should smoke first or smoke after, you'll probably get 50 telling you each one, and they'll be adamant that's the right way to do it. I know a lot of people that are smart and do a lot of barbecue that suggest either before or after. So to me, it's whatever's more convenient for you. I think after is a little bit easier because I like to sous vide them ahead of time. I chill them down and I can reheat them on the grill or on the smoker outside, and then I serve them fresh from the smoker. People are usually over when I'm serving ribs, so they get the aroma and they get the sight of the smoke and the scent of it, and it ties the entire meal together. So it's better for me, it's more convenient for me. That said, some people do like it beforehand. I've talked to both Darren Wilson from Firewater Cooking and Meathead Goldwyn from AmazingRibs.com, and they both smoke afterwards for a few different reasons. So I feel justified that at least I'm not doing something completely wrong by smoking after. But if you like to smoke first, if that's more convenient, go ahead and go for it. The only thing to remember is figure out your sous vide temperature first. Then when you smoke, make sure it stays below that temperature. Whether you're doing it before or after, you don't want to exceed it. I know some people go through all this effort to sous vide their ribs, and then they throw it on the smoker and they raise that temperature up to 180, 200, like you would if you're normally cooking ribs. Keep it below your sous vide temperature, and it's going to turn out much juicier and much more tender. So what is the process? Let's dive into the process for making some perfect sous vide ribs. To help with this, I'm going to link up my favorite simple sous vide pork rib master recipe. It makes it easy to put out a perfectly cooked pork rib every time that can then be served with your favorite sauces, sides, whatever you want at your barbecue. This works good with baby back ribs, spare ribs, or St. Louis style ribs. Whatever you have on hand, this recipe will help you get perfectly cooked, tender, moist, and juicy ribs every single time. The first step is to prep the ribs. You want to remove them from the store packaging. For whatever reason, everyone wants to leave their pork ribs in the store packaging. You can get away with it some of the time, but sometimes there's a little hole in the packaging. Sometimes the labels come off of the packaging and get stuck in your sous vide machine. And either way, you aren't seasoning them before you're cooking them. I always like to season my meat before I cook it, so I remove it from the store packaging. You can remove any fat and connective tissue. However you would normally clean ribs when you're going to grill them or smoke them is the best way to do it for sous vide as well. Sometimes I'm lazy and don't remove the connective tissue, and it generally works out just fine because of the longer cooking times, but clean them how you would normally clean your ribs. You can cook the entire rack whole if you have a big enough bag and sous vide machine, or you can break it down into ribs or quarters or halves, whatever is easiest for you. I've done it all different preparations, and a lot comes down to how are you serving it, what type of presentation you want for the people to see. For me, and in my New York apartment, as you can see here, is usually a lot easier for me to cut it into thirds or halves, and then it's a little more manageable both on the grill and in the sous vide machine. I'll always put on salt before I sous vide it, and a lot of times I'll also put on a spice rub. Some people are very much against adding spice rubs. I think it adds flavor to the outside, and I really enjoy experimenting with different ones. So do whatever you think's best. If you like having rubs on your ribs, then go ahead and put some on before sous vide and give that a try. Otherwise, you can hold off and you can put it on before you smoke it. So there's a lot of different options you have for when to add your rub. I usually put it on before I sous vide it. It's a little bit easier, more convenient for me, but do whatever works for you. At this point, it's time to seal the ribs. Put them in your sous vide bag in a single layer. You don't want to stack them up, otherwise they're not going to cook evenly through it. Any food safe, heat safe plastic bag works well. Ziploc brand freezer bags will work pretty good, especially if you're doing 150 or below temperatures. If you're going above, sometimes you might want to use 2 bags just just to make sure you don't spring any leaks over the longer cooking times with the higher temperatures. Edge vacuum sealers work really well. Food Saver is a classic one that's in a lot of homes, and chambered vacuum sealers work great as well. The thing to remember with chambered vacuum sealers is if you're going for a fancy presentation, anything with bones in it, some of the insides of the bones will get sucked out when you use a chambered vacuum sealer with too high of a vacuum. And that can lead to some discoloration, and it can look kind of ugly in the bag. So just keep that in mind. If you do have a chambered sealer, you can pull a little weaker of a vacuum, or you can just deal with a little discoloration. I normally just deal with it and people haven't noticed, but it is something, if you're going for a more refined presentation, keep that in mind. Now we just need to prepare the water bath. You just fill a container with water, and you can use any type of container. Obviously, if you're using an entire rack, you might want a larger polycarbonate container like Cambro or Lapavi both sell. If you're doing individual ribs or half racks, then a stock pot might work just fine. You could also use some of the smaller polycarbonate containers. I use 12 quart a lot of the time, and a lot of people use coolers, especially if you are going to finish these on a grill elsewhere. A lot of people will toss the hot water and the ribs into a cooler, and they're transported like that so they show up hot and ready to be finished. Set your sous vide machine to the desired temperature so you get the texture that you want at the end. As I said, this depends on your desired doneness. What are you trying to accomplish? I like 152 for most of my ribs, so that's what I go for, especially when I'm serving for parties. But 140 is that great chop-like kind of texture, or you can go up to 165 or 176 for a much more fall-apart texture. You can then throw the ribs into the water bath. You don't need to worry about letting it preheat. You're cooking them for a very long time, so it's going to even out over the long run. When you put them in the water, make sure that the ribs are all underwater, and most of the bag should be underwater. Anything that the raw pork touched, you want to be under the surface of the water. You're cooking this for 12 to 24 to 36 hours. You're going to be growing bacteria if something is sticking out of the water. So make sure things are under the water so they can get pasteurized and fully cooked under there. Now you just let this cook for the amount of time you need based on your temperature. Normally 12 to 24 hours, so you have a lot of time to do whatever you want. You can prep for your party, you can get your sides together, you can go take a 12-hour nap. There's a lot of things that you can do in that time, and that's what I love about sous vide is it's not hands-on. With a lot of traditional ways to cook ribs, you have to be watching and monitoring the process. With sous vide, set it and forget it. Once they've been cooked long enough and they're nice and tender, it's time for you to take them out of the water bath. Now, ribs and other barbecued meats that you're going to reheat on the smoker or grill are some of the things that I recommend almost always using an ice bath to chill. And there's several reasons for that, especially for ribs. They're thin, so you want to maximize the sear if you're going to do a quick sear. If you're going to do smoking, you want to maximize the amount of time they're in the smoke, and smoke adheres better to cold meat. So in all these cases, you want to use an ice bath. So take them out of the hot sous vide machine, put them in cold water or a cold ice bath, half ice, half water, chill that all the way down. At this point, you can actually put them in the fridge and store them for a few weeks, which is amazing. I'll do that for parties. I'll cook the food several days ahead of time. I'll chill it down. I'll put it in the fridge. Then when it's time for the party, I can just pull it out, reheat it on the grill or on the smoker, and I have perfectly cooked ribs every time. Even if my friends show up a few hours late, like some of them always do, the food's not ruined because I'm not smoking it for 4 to 8 hours before they even arrive. I can finish it last minute when they finally do get there. When you're ready to finish your ribs, you can either smoke them, you can grill them, you can pan fry them, kind of whatever you want. If you're going to smoke them, you want to leave them wet. When you take them out of the bag, you don't want to really dry them off. You want to put them on the smoker cold and wet. Smoke adheres a lot better to cold and wet meat than it does to hot meat. That's what Meathead and Darren Wilson tell me, and I trust the two of them very much. If you're going to just grill them, or you're going to pan fry them, or put them in a cast iron pan just to get a crust, or even broil them, then you want to dry them off really well. Any of those kind of quick cooking methods, you want to dry it off, and then you can reheat them over that high heat. In either case, you don't want the internal temperature to get above what you cooked it at. So as I said, I like 152. So when I reheat these things, I want to make sure that I cut off the sear at the end at around 140, 145, so the carryover doesn't go above 152 and ruin all the hard work that I did. So whether you're smoking it, whether you're finishing on a really hot grill, you want to make sure that core temperature stays below what you sous vide it at. And when it starts getting close to that, pull it off and you're now ready to eat perfectly cooked, tender, juicy, succulent ribs that are fall off the bone and are going to wow your friends and family. I've served these at multiple parties, and every time people just dive into the ribs and talk about how they're some of the best ribs they have ever had. So now you can impress your friends and family, and you can turn out perfectly cooked ribs whenever you want using sous vide. If you're just getting started with sous vide, I highly recommend checking out my free sous vide quick start course. You can find that at afmeasy.com/quickstart. And I also do a lot of work with the International Sous Vide Association. We have a lot of video demos, cook-alongs, recipes, a lot of fun stuff there, a lot of which is free. And you can check that out at the isva.org. Till next time, I'm Jason Longston.